The coffee pot shattered against the tile, and the man in the gray suit still had her wrist bent back behind her. She didn't scream. She just went quiet, the way a person goes quiet when screaming has never once helped. Every customer in that little roadside diner stared at their plates and pretended not to see. The man leaned in and told her she was nothing, that she'd always be nothing, and he wanted his money back with a tip for the trouble. Here is what none of them knew. The wedding ring on that woman's hand belonged to a man named Cole Vance, a man most folks only ever called boss, and right then, he was 3 miles up the road on a loud black motorcycle, coming home a full week early. Why would a man like that ride home without warning? Stay with me on this one. Cole Vance had ridden that stretch of highway 1,000 times, but he had never once ridden it a full week ahead of schedule. He'd been gone 19 days. 3 states away, burying a brother who went down on a wet road outside Tulsa, sitting with the man's widow, handling the kind of business a club president handles when one of his own doesn't come home. He had told Maggie he wouldn't be back until Friday. He'd told everybody Friday. But somewhere around 2 in the morning, in a motel that smelled like bleach and old cigarettes, he sat up in the dark and just knew he needed to be home. He couldn't have told you why. Sometimes a man knows a thing before he has the words for it. So he got dressed, he paid his tab, and he rode. He'd sat on the edge of that motel bed for a long while first, if I'm being honest about it. Boots already on, keys in his hand, and he'd told himself he was being foolish. An old man spooked by a funeral, seeing ghosts because he'd just put a good friend in the ground. He tried to lie back down twice. Both times that feeling sat on his chest like a stone and wouldn't let him breathe right. It wasn't grief. He knew what grief felt like. He'd shaken hands with it plenty. This was something else, something with an edge to it, a low hum like a wire pulled too tight. 20 years of leading men had taught Cole Vance to trust that hum, because every single time in his life he'd ignored it, somebody had bled for it. So around 2, he stopped arguing with himself. He wiped down the room out of old habit, left the widow's boy a fold of cash under the coffee maker where the kid would find it after he was gone, and he walked out into the dark and threw a leg over that bike and pointed it home. He figured he'd feel like a fool by sunup. He never did get to feel like a fool. He got to feel a lot of other things instead. Now let me tell you about Cole, because that word boss gets thrown around and people build the wrong picture in their heads. When folks hear Hell's Angels, they think of noise and trouble and busted knuckles. And sure, Cole had all of that in his younger years. He'd done a stretch in Folsom. He had scars he never explained, and a couple he'd stopped counting. He'd been president of the local charter for 20 years, and you did not get to be president of anything in that world by being soft. But the man was 54 now. The beard had gone mostly gray. And somewhere along the way he had gotten quiet in that particular way, that dangerous men get quiet when they no longer have anything left to prove. Cole didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. When Cole Vance walked into a room, the room adjusted itself around him without ever being asked. There's a thing that happens to certain men when they get old enough and have seen enough. The young ones, they're all noise and motion, because they're still trying to convince the world of something, and mostly they're trying to convince themselves. Cole had been that young man once. He'd broken a jaw over a parking space when he was 26. He'd spent nights he wasn't proud of, and mornings he was less proud of. But he'd watched 2 generations of hard men burn themselves down to nothing, watched them chase the fear in other people's eyes like it was a drug, and one day, somewhere in his 40s, Cole had simply set it down. Not because he'd gone soft, because he'd finally understood that the fear was never the point. A man who needs you afraid of him is a man who's still afraid himself. The truly settled ones, they've got nothing to prove and nothing to sell. And that emptiness where the fear used to be, that's the most frightening thing of all, because you cannot bargain with it. You cannot bluff it. That was Cole now. And the reason he'd gotten there, the real reason, was a woman named Maggie. He met her 8 years back, in the very diner we're talking about, a little chrome and glass place called Rosie's out on the county road. She was a waitress there. She'd poured his coffee, and she hadn't flinched at his colors, hadn't looked at his patch like it was a warning sign, hadn't done any of the things people usually did. She just called him honey and asked if he wanted pie. Maggie had her own hard road behind her, one she rarely talked about. A first husband who used his fists. Years of learning to make herself small and quiet so the storm would pass over her instead of through her. That habit of going still, of swallowing whatever was done to her, it never fully left her. Cole understood that better than anybody. He'd spent 8 years slowly teaching her that she never had to go small again. That she was married to a man now who would burn down the sky before he'd let a single soul lay a hand on her. I'll tell you a little more about those 8 years, because they matter to what's coming. When Cole first started courting her, and I use that old word on purpose because that's exactly what he did, he courted her, slow and patient like a man gentling a horse that's been whipped. Maggie would flinch if he raised his hand too fast, even just to scratch his own head. She'd get quiet in a certain way whenever a man's voice got loud 2 tables over, go still and watchful, ready to disappear. Cole noticed everything. He never said a word about it. He just started moving slower around her. He'd tell her before he did anything with his hands, so she was never surprised. He learned which stories from her old life she could tell, and which ones would shut her down for a whole day. He learned that she flinched at the smell of a certain cheap whiskey her first husband used to drink, and so, in 8 years, Cole Vance never once brought that brand into their house. It took him 3 years to get her to raise her voice at him. He counted it a victory, the first time she got genuinely angry and hollered at him over something small and then froze, terrified, waiting to be hit. He just grinned at her and said, "There she is." And Maggie had started to cry, because no man had ever been glad to see her angry before. That was the marriage. That was what Gordon Cale walked into the middle of without ever knowing it, a thing built brick by careful brick over 8 years, and set his hand on it like it was nothing. Which is exactly why what happened next matters so much. Because Maggie never told him. Here is the thing you have to understand about small towns like Cedar Hollow. They run on trust and habit. Same faces at the counter every morning. Rosie behind the register for 31 years, calling everybody by name. The millmen at 6, the ranch hands at 7, the retired folks nursing decaf until 10. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, and everybody liked it that way. Maggie liked it most of all. After the life she'd survived, boring was a gift she unwrapped every single morning. You have to understand what a place like that really is underneath. It isn't the buildings. The buildings weren't much. A feed store, a church, a gas station, a bank the size of a shoebox, the mill down by the creek that gave half the town its paychecks. It was the web of it. It was Rosie knowing that Pete took his coffee black because his late wife used to nag him about the sugar, and drinking it black was the closest he could get to talking to her. It was the mill men knowing whose boy had made varsity and whose marriage was on the rocks and quietly covering a shift when a man needed to be home. It was 31 years of Christmases and funerals and burnt Thanksgiving turkeys and kids growing up and going off and coming back. That web is the actual town. You can't buy it and you can't build it. And a man like Gordon Cale never once in his life understood that it existed, which is precisely why he thought he could roll into Cedar Hollow with a checkbook and walk out owning it. He thought a town was land with people standing on it. He never grasped that it was the other way around. But about 4 months back, a man had come to town, and boring started to die. His name was Gordon Cale. He drove a black car that cost more than most houses on that county road, and he wore gray suits with no wrinkles in them, and he had a way of looking at people like he was pricing them. Cale was a developer. He'd bought up a company that was putting a new interstate interchange through the valley, and Cedar Hollow sat right in the middle of where he wanted it. A big off-ramp, gas stations, a truck plaza, one of those hotels that all look the same. Money, the kind of money that changes a place forever. And to build it, Cale needed land. Lots of it. Parcel by parcel, he'd been buying the town out from under itself. Some folks sold because the offer was fair. Some sold because the offer stopped being fair and started being a threat. And one by one, the old faces went away. Now I want to stop here and tell you about the Hendersons, because their story is the whole story in miniature, and because if you'd have watched what happened to them, you'd understand why the whole town went so quiet so fast. Bill and Carol Henderson ran the feed store, had for 22 years, right at the north end of the main drag. Good people. The kind who'd float a rancher's account through a bad winter and never say a word about it. Their store sat on a corner Cale wanted for a gas station. So Cale made them an offer, and it was a fair one at first, generous even, and Bill Henderson turned it down because that store was going to go to his son one day. That was the whole plan of his life. And that's when Gordon Cale showed Bill Henderson what kind of man he was. It started with the store's supplier. Cale had money in a lot of things, more than anybody in Cedar Hollow understood, and the outfit that trucked feed to the Hendersons suddenly found reasons to be late, then later, then to not show at all. Bill's shelves went bare. His customers, ranchers who couldn't wait a week for hay, started driving 40 minutes to the next town over. Then the bank, the little shoebox bank that Cale by then had his hooks into, got real particular about the Hendersons' line of credit. Called it in early. And then the county inspector, the same one you're going to hear about again in a minute, found a problem with the store's wiring that had never been a problem in 22 years, and shut them down for a month of repairs they couldn't afford because their credit was gone and their customers were gone, and their supplier was gone. By the end of it, Bill Henderson sold the store for less than half of Cale's first offer, and he signed the paper with a hand that shook, and his boy left the county that same summer to go work in a warehouse 300 miles away, and Bill and Carol moved into a rented double-wide out past the county line and stopped coming to church. Nobody ever saw Bill smile again. I mean that. Some folks say he died of a heart attack the next spring. Rosie always said it wasn't his heart that killed him. And every single soul in Cedar Hollow watched that happen. That's the thing. Cale wanted them to watch. The Hendersons weren't just a purchase. They were a sermon, and the sermon was this: I can take everything you have and make you thank me for the scraps, and there is nothing any of you can do about it, so save us both the trouble and sign. After the Hendersons, the parcels started falling like dominoes. The gas station sold. The 2 houses by the creek sold. The mill's owner, an old man in poor health, took Cale's money and retired to Arizona, and the new management started talking about closing the mill entirely once the interchange came through, which meant half the town's jobs were suddenly hanging by a thread that Gordon Cale held in his hand. That's how you buy a town. You don't buy the town. You buy the fear, and then the fear does the rest of your buying for you. By the time Cole rode off to bury his brother, only 2 holdouts were left standing on the last piece of ground Cale needed. Rosie and the diner. Cole knew none of this. Maggie had made sure of it. Every phone call while he was gone, she'd kept her voice light. Told him the town was fine. Told him she missed him and to ride safe and to come home in one piece. Because she knew her husband. She knew that if Cole Vance found out some man in a gray suit was leaning on his wife, there would be no talking him down. And Cole was trying so hard to stay clean these days. The club was under a microscope. One wrong move, one bad night, and it could all come apart. So Maggie carried it alone, the way she'd once carried everything alone, and she told herself she could hold on until Friday, when her husband came home and the world felt safe again. And I'll tell you what it cost her to carry it, because it wasn't nothing. Maggie stopped sleeping right somewhere in the 2nd week. She'd lie awake in that quiet house with Cole's side of the bed empty and cold and go over it and over it, whether she was doing the right thing, whether keeping it from him was protecting him or betraying him, and she never could settle it. She lost weight. Rosie noticed, told her she looked peaked, and Maggie lied and said it was just a summer bug. She started keeping the phone in her hand at all hours, waiting for it to be Friday, counting the days down on the little calendar by the register the way a prisoner scratches marks on a wall. And the whole time she wore the same face she'd worn her whole first marriage, the pleasant, quiet, everything's fine face, the mask a woman learns to wear when the truth is too dangerous to let out onto her features. She'd gotten so good at that mask over the years that not one person who came into that diner ever guessed she was drowning behind it. That's the tragedy of a woman like Maggie. She'd survived by becoming invisible, and now that she needed somebody to see her, nobody could, because she'd spent her whole life making sure they couldn't. She had no idea he'd be early. And she had no idea that this particular afternoon, Gordon Cale had decided he was done being patient. Cole crested the hill above the valley, a little after 4 o'clock. He could see the whole town laid out below him, the water tower, the church steeple, the thin gray ribbon of the county road. He'd stopped an hour back and bought flowers, wildflowers wrapped in brown paper, sitting in his saddlebag right then, because it was their anniversary that weekend and he wanted to surprise her. He was thinking about her face. He was thinking about how she'd laugh and swat his arm and call him a soft old fool for buying flowers. He rolled the throttle and started down toward home, and he had no idea he was riding straight into the worst thing he'd ever seen. Let me back up now and tell you about Maggie's afternoon. Because to understand what Cole walked into, you have to understand what she'd been swallowing for months. It had started small. That's how these things always start. Cale came into Rosie's the first time back in the spring, sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and asked to speak to the owner. Rosie came out wiping her hands, and Cale slid a folded piece of paper across the counter with a number on it. A number to buy the whole place. Rosie laughed at him. She thought he was joking. This diner had been in her family since her daddy poured the first cup in 1961. It wasn't for sale, not for any number, and she told him so, polite as could be. Cale didn't laugh back. He just folded the paper up, put it back in his pocket, and said, real quiet, "Everybody sells eventually, ma'am. It's only ever a question of the price and the pain." Then he left $1 on the counter and walked out. After that, he came in a lot. And every time, it got a little worse. He'd sit at Maggie's tables on purpose, order things and send them back, complain the coffee was cold when he'd let it sit an hour, complain the eggs were wrong, snap his fingers at her like she was a dog. Maggie took it. She'd learned to take it in another life. She'd smile and say sorry and fix his plate and refill his cup, and something in his eyes lit up every time she folded, because men like Cale don't just want the land. They want to watch you bend. It fed something in him. And here I have to tell you about a young man named Danny Reyes, because he's the part of this story that most folks leave out. And he's the part that ought to give you a little hope about people even when they disappoint you. Danny was 23, grew up in Cedar Hollow, used to bus tables at Rosie's when he was in high school. Rosie had practically raised him after his mother took sick. When Cale came to town flashing money and hiring local muscle to stand around and look big, Danny took the job because his mother's medical bills were a mountain, and the mill was cutting hours, and a young man with no prospects will talk himself into a lot of things when there's a sick mother in the picture. So Danny became one of the two big quiet men who stood by the door with their arms crossed while Cale worked. And every day it ate at him a little more. He'd stand there in his cheap dark jacket watching Gordon Cale humiliate the woman who used to slip him free pie when he was a hungry kid, and he'd stare at the floor and tell himself it was just a job, tell himself he wasn't the one doing it, tell himself his mother needed the money. But it doesn't work like that, does it? A man knows when he's standing on the wrong side of a room. Danny knew. He just didn't know yet what he was going to do about it. Hold on to Danny. He comes back. Now here is where it gets ugly. About 3 weeks back, right after Cole left town, Cale figured out who Maggie was married to. Somebody told him. And instead of scaring him off, it did the opposite. It made the game more fun. Because if he could break the wife of the local Hells Angels president, if he could make her sign and make her small and make her run, well, that was a story he could dine out on for years. That was power. So he leaned harder. He started coming in with 2 men who worked for him, big quiet men who stood by the door with their arms crossed. He started talking louder. Started making sure the whole diner heard him call Maggie stupid, call her trash, ask her out loud how a woman like her had ended up married to a criminal, and whether she knew her husband was going to prison and leaving her with nothing. And the town watched. That's the part that ate at Rosie later. The whole town sat there and watched it happen and said nothing, because Gordon Cale owned half their mortgages by then and the other half were scared. Even the law had gone quiet. Sheriff Boyd Tanner used to eat lunch at Rosie's twice a week. Lately, he wouldn't meet Maggie's eyes. When Rosie called the county about Cale's men blocking her lot and scaring off customers, nobody ever came. Nobody ever came at all. And Maggie began to understand something cold and simple. There was no one coming to help. Not the law, not the neighbors, not anybody. She was on her own, exactly like the old days, and all she could do was keep her head down and wait for Friday. I want to say a word about Sheriff Boyd Tanner, because his is a small and shabby little tragedy tucked inside the big one, and it's the kind that happens in 1,000 towns you've never heard of. Boyd Tanner wasn't a monster. That's what makes it worse. He was a weak man in a job that needed a strong one, 26 years behind the badge, 3 years from a pension, a wife who wanted a place on the lake, and a daughter starting college he couldn't afford. Cale found him the way a wolf finds the slowest deer in the herd. It didn't start with a bag of money. It started with a favor. A campaign contribution, all legal. Then dinner. Then a fishing trip on a nice boat, and the boat felt good, and the attention felt good. A rich, powerful man treating old Boyd like he mattered. And then one day Cale needed a small thing, a report worded a certain way, a complaint that didn't get filed, and Boyd told himself it was nothing and it was easy and nobody got hurt. And the next thing was a little bigger. And the next. That's how they get you. Not all at once. An inch at a time, each inch small enough to explain away, until one morning you look up and you're standing knee-deep in it, and there's no clean way back to shore. By the time Cale needed a condemnation order signed on a healthy diner, Boyd Tanner was in so deep that signing it felt like just one more inch. He signed it in his office with the blinds drawn, and then he sat there a long time not looking at anything. He knew, somewhere in the back of his weak and frightened heart, that he'd become the thing he'd once put men in cages for. He just couldn't figure out how to stop. Remember Boyd. He's got one more choice coming, and it's the only good one he makes in this whole story. The afternoon it all came apart started ordinary enough. Slow day. A couple of truckers in the corner booth, an old rancher named Pete nursing his coffee, Rosie doing the books in back. Maggie was wiping down the counter and watching the clock and thinking about her husband, when the black car pulled into the lot and parked crooked across 2 spaces, and Gordon Cale got out with his 2 men and a leather folder under his arm. Danny Reyes was one of those 2 men. And Danny had woken up that morning with a bad feeling in his gut, because the night before he'd overheard Cale on the phone in the motel parking lot, talking low and pleased about how tomorrow it would finally be done, how the paper had come through, and Danny didn't know exactly what paper, but he knew the tone of a man about to enjoy himself. So Danny got out of that black car with his stomach in a knot, and he took his place by the door like always, and he told himself, one more time, the old lie. Just a job. Not me doing it. He didn't sit down this time. That was the first thing that felt wrong. He walked straight to the counter, set the folder down and opened it, and inside was a stack of papers and a pen. He looked at Maggie and he smiled and he said, "Where's the old woman? Today's the day she signs." Maggie told him Rosie wasn't selling. Kept her voice steady, even. Told him he needed to leave. And Cale, still smiling, reached across the counter and took the coffee pot right out of her hand and poured it out slow onto the floor, watching her the whole time. "That's not really up to you, sweetheart," he said. "Go get her. Now, I want you to sit with that image for a second." A gray afternoon. An empty highway. A quiet woman in an apron who'd spent her whole life being told to make herself small, standing behind a counter while a rich man poured coffee on the floor of the only place that had ever felt safe to her. And out the window, past his shoulder, the county road stretched away empty in both directions. Nobody coming. Nobody at all. Except somebody was coming. She just didn't know it yet. Because right about then, 3 miles up that road, Cole Vance had reached the bottom of the hill and rolled to a stop at the old crossroads to let a hay truck pass. He was maybe 4 minutes out. 4 minutes. He was still thinking about wildflowers. And I'll tell you a thing he did at that crossroads while he waited on that hay truck, because it matters more than he knew at the time. That low hum in his chest, the one that had gotten him out of bed at 2 in the morning, it had been getting louder the closer he got to town, and sitting there at the crossroads it was near to screaming. So Cole, who did not ignore that feeling anymore, not ever, pulled out that old cheap phone and made 2 calls. Just in case. He didn't know what he was calling about. He only knew the hum. And those 2 calls, made blind, made on nothing but a feeling at an empty crossroads, are the reason this story ends the way it does. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me get back to the diner, where things were about to get worse than they'd ever been. Cale sent one of his men into the back to fetch Rosie. He sent Danny. And Danny walked to the back on legs that didn't feel like his own, and he found Rosie at the little desk over her books, and he stood in the doorway. And for just a second, the woman who'd fed him pie when he was hungry looked up at the man he'd become, standing there in his dark jacket doing Gordon Cale's errands, and she didn't say anything cruel to him. That was the thing that broke him later. She didn't call him a traitor. She just looked at him with a kind of sorrow, like she was sorry for him, and she said, "Oh, Danny." That's all. "Oh, Danny." And something in the young man's chest cracked clean down the middle. He didn't act on it yet. He was still afraid, still thinking about his mother's bills. But it cracked, and it wasn't going to uncrack. Hold on. Danny's coming. And that's where it should have ended, honestly. A tense standoff, an old woman refusing to sign, a bully leaving frustrated. That's how it had gone every other time. Maggie braced for it. She figured he'd yell, threaten, make his little speech and go. She figured she just had to survive the next 10 minutes. She wiped the spilled coffee off the counter with a rag, and her hands were steady, and she thought to herself, almost there, almost Friday, almost home. The truckers went back to their food. Old Pete stirred his coffee. Somewhere in the kitchen, a radio was playing something soft and easy. For about 30 seconds, the diner was just a diner again, and the worst of it seemed to be passing, the way storms always passed if you just stayed small and quiet and waited them out. That's when Rosie came out of the back with Danny behind her, and she wasn't holding a pen. She was holding a folded letter, and her hands were shaking, and her face had gone the color of ash. "You want to explain this," she said to Cale, and her voice cracked right down the middle. "You want to explain what this is?" Here is where everything changed. Because it turned out this was never really about a diner. The letter in Rosie's hand had come in that morning's mail, on county letterhead, signed by Sheriff Boyd Tanner and a county judge. It was a condemnation notice. Eminent domain. It said the diner and the land under it had been declared unsafe and unfit, condemned for public use, and that Rosie had 72 hours to vacate the premises before the county took possession and demolished the building. 72 hours. For a diner that had passed every inspection for 31 years. And at the bottom, in the fine print, was the name of the company the land would be transferred to for development. Cale's Company. And just like that, this stopped being one rude man in a diner. This became a machine. Because you don't get a condemnation order signed by a judge and a sheriff on a healthy building overnight. You don't do that unless the sheriff is bought, and the inspector is bought, and the judge is looking the other way, and the whole thing has been greased quietly for months while everybody smiled at you in the street. Cale hadn't been coming in to wear Maggie down for fun. He'd been running out the clock. Stalling. Keeping the two women calm and small and hopeful, while the real trap closed around them in offices they'd never see. The harassment was theater. The paper was the knife. And now the paper was on the counter, and there was nothing anyone in that room could do about it, because the law itself had already been bought and paid for. And this, right here, is where you understand what a patient kind of evil Gordon Cale really was. All that abuse, all those months of snapping his fingers and pouring out coffee and calling Maggie names in front of the whole town, none of it had been the plan. It had just been sport. Entertainment to pass the time, while the real work got done in courthouses and inspection offices where nobody could see. He'd been playing with them, the way a cat plays, and the whole while the paper was moving through the dark toward this exact morning. He could have just served the notice cold in the mail and won. But that wouldn't have been any fun. He wanted to be standing right there when they found out. He wanted to watch their faces when they understood that all their hope and all their waiting had been a joke he'd been telling at their expense for 4 months. That's the part you have to sit with about Gordon Cale. The cruelty wasn't a means to the money. Somewhere along the way, for men like him, the cruelty becomes the whole point, and the money's just the excuse. Rosie understood it all at once, and her legs went out from under her. She caught the edge of the counter. "You can't," she whispered. "This is my whole life. My daddy built this." Cale picked up the pen and clicked it. "I can and I did," he said, pleasant as Sunday. "But I'm a generous man, Rosie. Sign my offer right now, and I'll pay you a fraction of what I would have. Refuse, and in 3 days the county takes it for nothing and hands it to me anyway, and you walk away with the clothes on your back. Either way, I get the land. The only thing you get to decide is how much it hurts." He looked at Maggie then, and his smile widened. "Same as I always told you, honey. Price and pain." And Maggie, God bless her, quiet Maggie who'd spent her whole life being small, looked at that piece of paper and looked at Rosie's ruined face, and something in her, that had been folding for months finally stopped folding. She reached out, and she took the condemnation notice off the counter, and she tore it in half. "Get out of our diner," she said. The room went dead silent. And I need you to hear me right now, because this is the moment the whole thing turned. If you're still with me and you want to see this bully get exactly what's coming to him, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because the reveal is close, and you are not going to want to miss what happens next. Cale stopped smiling. For a long second, he just stared at the two halves of the notice in her hands. Then he set the pen down very slowly, and he nodded to himself, like a man who'd finally decided something. "You know," he said, "I've been polite. I've been so polite. Because I figured a woman who married garbage would understand a threat without me having to make it plain." He came around the end of the counter. The two men by the door pushed off the wall. Only one of them did, really. Old Pete stood up, and Cale's other man put a hand flat on his chest and shoved him back down into his seat. Danny didn't. Danny stayed by the door, and his hands had curled into fists at his sides, and nobody was looking at him, so nobody saw it yet. The truckers looked at their laps. "So let me make it plain," Cale said, and he reached out and took Maggie's wrist. She pulled back. He didn't let go. He twisted, hard, turning her arm up behind her, and forced her forward against the counter, and the coffee pot she'd set down went over the edge and shattered on the tile in a spray of glass and cold coffee. Maggie made a small sound just once. And Cale leaned in close to her ear, close enough that the whole diner heard it in the silence, and he said, "You are nothing. You have always been nothing, and when I am done you will have nothing, and that criminal you married won't be around to save you. Now you're going to apologize, you're going to clean up this mess you made, and then you're going to bring me my coffee money back with a tip for wasting my afternoon." Nobody moved. Rosie was crying. The radio in the kitchen kept playing something soft. And Maggie, bent over that counter with her arm wrenched up behind her, did the only thing she had ever known how to do in a moment like this. She went quiet. She went still. She waited for it to pass. And that is the exact moment Cole, Vance's motorcycle, turned into the lot. You could hear it before you could see it. That low, hard rumble that rolls in your chest before it ever hits your ears. Cale heard it and didn't think a thing of it. Just a bike. But Maggie heard it, and every muscle in her body went rigid, because after 8 years she knew the sound of that particular engine the way she knew her own heartbeat. Her head came up. And through the big front window, past Cale's shoulder, past the two men and the shattered glass and the whole frozen room, she saw a black motorcycle roll to a stop beside a crooked black car, and she saw her husband swing his leg off the seat, and she saw him take off his sunglasses and fold them and put them in his vest pocket, the way he always did, slow, unhurried, a man in no rush at all. He hadn't seen inside yet. He was reaching into the saddlebag for the flowers. Then he straightened up, brown paper in his hand, and he looked through the window of Rosie's diner, and he saw his wife bent over a counter with her arm twisted up behind her back, and a man in a gray suit leaning over her. I have known Cole Vance a long time, and I will tell you, I have never seen a man's face change the way his changed in that 1 second. It didn't twist up with rage. It didn't go red. It did the opposite. It went smooth. It went calm and cold and empty, and the flowers dropped out of his hand onto the gravel, and he started walking toward the door, and he was not in any hurry at all. The little bell over the door rang. Cale didn't even look up. Still bent over Maggie, still gripping her arm, he said to the door, "We're closed. Get out." And it was Danny who turned, Danny who looked, and whatever Danny saw in that man's calm, empty face made the young man take a step back and say, "Lo, boss." "Mr. Cale." Something in the man's voice finally made Cale glance toward the door. And there stood Cole Vance. 6'2" in his boots, gray in his beard, the death's head patch on his back and the word president stitched over his heart, standing just inside the door of that little diner with his hands loose at his sides, and his eyes fixed on the hand that was holding his wife. He didn't say anything. He just looked at that hand. And the whole room understood all at once that the temperature had just dropped 50 degrees. Cale didn't understand yet. He was so full of himself, so used to everyone folding, that he actually smiled. "The diner's closed, friend," he said. "Whatever you're selling, we don't want it. Take your little costume and—" "Let go of her wrist," Cole said. He said it quiet. He didn't raise his voice a hair. But something in the way he said it made one of the truckers in the corner very carefully slide out of the booth and press himself against the wall, out of the way. Cale laughed. He actually laughed. "Or what, old man?" And to prove a point, to show this biker exactly who ran things around here, he twisted Maggie's arm a little harder and she gasped, and he looked Cole dead in the eye while he did it. "This is my town now. Every road, every badge, every judge. You understand? I own the sheriff. I own the county. So why don't you turn around and—" "Cole." It was Maggie. Bent over that counter, her voice small and steady, she said one word. She said his name. "Cole." And Gordon Cale felt the man's hand go still on his wrist, and he watched every drop of color drain out of the developer's face, because he had just heard the biker's name and the wife's mouth in the same breath, and a very ugly piece of arithmetic was starting to add up in his head. "Cole," Cale said slowly. As in her husband." Cole said, "Yeah. Now let me tell you what didn't happen next, because this is the part people always get wrong when they imagine a man like Cole. He didn't roar across that room. He didn't flip a table or throw a punch or pull a weapon. That's the movies. Real dangerous men, the genuine article, they don't need any of that." Cole crossed the diner slow, one boot in front of the other, and Cale's two men, the big quiet ones who'd been so brave shoving old Pete around, well. One of them looked at that patch and looked at that face and did the math on his paycheck versus his life, and he stepped back. He stepped clean out of the way. Because there is loyalty, and then there is the number of years Gordon Cale was not worth to him. But Danny Reyes didn't step back. This is Danny's moment, the one I told you was coming. While the other hired man was busy saving his own skin, young Danny Reyes stepped forward instead, and he walked over to the counter, and everybody tensed up thinking he was going to do something for Cale. And Gordon Cale, feeling the walls close in, snapped at him, "Reyes, get this animal out of my—" And Danny Reyes reached down and took Gordon Cale's wrist, the same way Cale was holding Maggie's, and he peeled the man's fingers off of her, one at a time, and he said, in a voice that shook but did not stop, "You let go of her, mister. Cale, you should have let go a long time ago." And then Danny looked at Rosie, the woman who'd fed him when he was hungry, and his eyes were wet, and he said, "I'm sorry, Rosie. I'm real sorry. I shouldn't have ever put this jacket on." And he took that dark jacket off right there and dropped it on the floor in the coffee and the glass. That's Danny. That's the boy choosing, finally, which side of the room he was going to stand on, and choosing it with a Hells Angels president bearing down and Gordon Cale still, for another minute or two, believing himself the most powerful man in the county. It's the bravest thing anybody did in that diner all afternoon, and hardly anybody ever remembers it, so I wanted you to. Cale finally let go of Maggie's wrist, or rather Danny let go of it for him, and he straightened up and put his hands out, palms open, and started talking fast. "Now let's all be reasonable. This is a business matter. A legal matter. I have papers, I have the county behind me. You lay one finger on me and the sheriff." "Maggie." Cole didn't look away from Cale, but he spoke to his wife, and his voice was gentle now, completely different, the voice he used only for her. "You all right, baby? He hurt you?" Maggie stood up straight and rubbed her wrist. And she looked at her husband, and after everything, after months of swallowing it and going small and telling herself no one was coming, she felt the tears come, and she nodded, and then she shook her head, and then she just said, "You're a week early." "Yeah," Cole said. "I got a feeling." He stopped an arm's length from Cale. Up close, the developer was a smaller man than he'd seemed, the way they always are. Cole looked down at him for a long moment. And then he did something nobody expected. He reached past Cale, real slow, and he picked up the leather folder off the counter, the one with the offer and the papers in it, and he opened it and looked at it while Cale sputtered. He read it. He read the condemnation notice, the halves Maggie had torn, taped in his mind back together. He read the name of the company. He read the sheriff's signature. And the calm on his face never once cracked, and somehow that was the most frightening thing in the room. "So here's what I understand," Cole said, setting the folder down. "You've been coming into my wife's work for months, calling her names, sending your boys to scare a 60-year-old woman. And now you've got a paper says you're gonna knock this place down in 3 days and take Rosie's whole life for pennies. And you got the sheriff's name right here on the bottom of it to make it legal." He nodded slowly. "That about the size of it?" Cale lifted his chin. He was scared now, you could see it, but he still had that arrogance, that bone-deep certainty that money and paper would save him like they always had. "It's completely legal," he said. "Every bit of it. So whatever you're thinking of doing, biker, you should think real hard, because I will have you back in a cell before sundown. I own this county. There is nothing you can do to me." And Cole Vance smiled for the first time since he'd walked in. It was not a warm smile. "See, that's where you're wrong," he said. "You think because you bought the sheriff, you bought the law. But you didn't buy the law, Gordon. You just bought one fat, crooked man in a uniform. And the thing about a fella like that is, the second the wind changes, he'll sign anything to save his own hide. including a statement about who exactly told him to condemn a diner that passed inspection last month. Cole reached into his vest and Cale flinched hard, but all Cole pulled out was a phone. An old, cheap phone. He set it on the counter. "Now I want you to listen real careful, because I'm only gonna explain this once, and then things are gonna happen fast." He nodded toward the window, toward the county road. "About 20 minutes ago, I called some friends. See, I could feel something was wrong before I ever hit town, so I made a couple calls from the crossroads. One of them was to a brother of mine, does investigations. Been sitting on your Sheriff Tanner for a while now on account of Tanner. Ran his mouth in a bar about a developer paying him to make problems disappear. Turns out my brother's got a whole file. Bank records. A boat Tanner bought with cash he don't have. Which, funny thing, matches up real neat with a company called Cale Development Partners." Cole tilted his head. "You following me so far, Gordon? Because right now, that file is going 3 places at once. The state attorney general, the FBI field office 2 counties over, the one you don't own, and a reporter at the city paper who's been trying to figure out for a year how a small-town developer got so many condemnation orders signed so fast." The blood was gone from Cale's face entirely now. "You're bluffing," he whispered. "Maybe," Cole said. "Want to bet Rosie's Diner on it? And I'll tell you the truth of it, the part Cole didn't say out loud. Some of that was bluff. His brother did do investigations, and Tanner had run his mouth in a bar. That part was real, but the file hadn't been a file that morning. It had been a hunch and a couple of loose threads. What Cole had actually done from that crossroads was call his brother and say, 'Dig, fast, everything you've got on a Cedar Hollow sheriff and a developer, and send it everywhere you can before sundown.' He didn't know yet what it would turn up. He was betting, the same as Cale said, betting that a man like Boyd Tanner, weak and frightened and 3 years from a pension, would crack wide open the moment a real investigation so much as knocked on his door, and that once he cracked, the whole rotten structure would come down on the man who built it. That's the thing about Cole. He didn't beat you with what he had. He beat you with what you were most afraid was true. And what Gordon Cale was most afraid was true was that his sheriff was a coward. Which he was. Right about then, the low rumble started again outside. Only this time it wasn't one engine. It was a lot of them. Cale turned to the window and the whole diner turned with him, and out on the county road, rolling in slow and loud and steady, came a line of motorcycles. A dozen of them. Then 2 dozen. The local charter, and then some, headlights on in the gray afternoon, filling that empty road that Maggie had stared down for months believing no one was coming. They rolled into the lot and around the black car and cut their engines one by one, and the silence after was enormous. Big men in colors swung off their bikes and stood in the gravel with their arms folded, not doing a single thing, just standing there, looking at the diner. Not a one of them so much as raised a fist. They didn't need to. That was the whole point. That was the second call Cole made from the crossroads, if you were wondering. Just before he rode the last 3 miles in, riding on nothing but that hum in his chest, he'd called his road captain and said, "Get the boys, come to Rosie's. Don't ask, just come, and come quiet and come peaceful, and don't a one of you so much as spit on the sidewalk when you get there." because Cole knew even then, sitting at that crossroads not knowing a single fact, that whatever was wrong in Cedar Hollow, the answer wasn't going to be fists. The answer was going to be presence. It was going to be a whole town's worth of frightened people looking out a window and finally seeing that somebody had come. That's a different kind of weapon than the one everybody expects from men like that. It's a heavier one. Cale's other hired man was already gone. He'd slipped out the side while everyone watched the road, gotten in a truck and left. That's loyalty for you, when the paycheck stops making sense. Only Danny stayed, standing there in his shirt sleeves with his jacket and the coffee at his feet, on the right side of the room at last. "You can't threaten me." Cale tried, but his voice had gone thin and high. "This is intimidation. This is a crime. I'll have every one of you." "Nobody's threatening you, Gordon," Cole said, and he spread his hands wide, taking in the whole quiet room, the men outside standing peaceful as churchgoers. "You see anybody threaten you? These are just some folks who came to have pie. Ask anybody. Ask Rosie. Ask the sheriff when he gets here." He checked the old phone on the counter, which ought to be any minute, matter of fact, because the state boys called him 20 minutes ago and asked him to come explain a few signatures. I imagine he's real motivated right now to tell them whose idea all this was. Aren't you the one always saying it? Everybody sells eventually. It's just a question of the price and the pain. Cole leaned in close, the way Cale had leaned in close to Maggie, and dropped his voice down low so only the developer could hear it. "Your sheriff's about to sell you Gordon. And he's gonna get a real good price." And that was the moment Gordon Cale finally, truly understood that he had lost. You could watch it hit him. The arrogance just slid right off his face and left something small and gray and frightened behind. A man who had spent his whole life certain that money made him untouchable, standing in a diner he tried to steal, surrounded by the consequences of every cruel thing he'd ever done, with the law finally coming down the road for the wrong man for once. He grabbed for the leather folder. Cole put one hand flat on it. "That stays," Cole said. "That's evidence now. You can go, though. Nobody here's gonna lay a hand on you. Walk on out to your car and drive away, and every man in that lot is gonna step aside and let you pass, and you're gonna feel real relieved for about a mile. And then you're gonna see the lights behind you." He picked up the taped-together halves of the condemnation notice and pressed them into Cale's chest. "Take your paper. It's worth about as much as you are now." Cale looked around the room one last time. At Rosie, standing tall now, wiping her eyes. At old Pete. At the truckers. At Danny in his shirt sleeves, who wouldn't look at him. At Maggie, holding her own wrist, watching him with a steadiness she hadn't had an hour ago. Nobody was afraid of him anymore. That was the thing he couldn't stand, worse than any beating, worse than any threat. In the space of 10 minutes, Gordon Cale had become the smallest person in the room, and everyone could see it. He shoved the door open and walked out through the parked bikes, and true to Cole's word, not one man touched him. They just stepped aside, slow, and watched him go, and the sound of his own footsteps on the gravel was the loudest thing in that lot. He made it about a mile and a half up the county road before the sheriff's cruisers passed him going the other way. 3 of them, lights and all, and Gordon Cale watched them shrink in his mirror and knew exactly where they were going and exactly whose name Sheriff Boyd Tanner was going to give up the second they sat him down. He pulled over on the shoulder and put his head against the wheel. But I'll get to all that. Let me stay in the diner a minute, because the part that matters most happened after he left. Cole turned around, and the calm went out of his face, and there was just a tired old man standing there. He crossed to Maggie and he took her hand, the wrist Cale had twisted, and he turned it over gentle and looked at the red marks starting to come up on her skin, and his jaw worked. And for a second the calm threatened to break into something else, something with a body count. But he breathed it back down. Because that's the whole discipline of a man like Cole, you understand. The rage is easy. Any fool has rage. It's the swallowing of it, the choosing not to, that's the hard part. And it's the only thing that separates a protector from just another bully with a different patch. Why didn't you tell me? He said soft. 19 days, Maggie. Every phone call. Why didn't you tell me what he was doing to you? And Maggie looked up at him, and the tears came for real now, months of them, and she said the truest thing. Because I know you, she whispered. And I couldn't lose you again. Not to a cage. Not over some man in a suit. I kept thinking I could just be small and quiet and wait it out. I've always been able to wait it out. She wiped her face. But Cole, I'm so tired of being small. Cole pulled her in and held her, right there in front of everybody in the middle of the broken glass and spilled coffee, and he put his hand on the back of her head, and he said into her hair, "You don't ever have to be small again. You hear me? Never again. That's over. I don't care if it's a man in a suit, or the whole county, or God himself. Anybody comes at you, they come through me first, and they are gonna find that a real bad place to be." And Rosie was crying, and old Pete was crying, and one of the truckers cleared his throat about 9 times, and Danny Reyes stood off to the side with his jacket at his feet and cried too, quiet, the way a young man cries when he's just found out the hard way what kind of man he wants to be. And outside 3 dozen of the hardest men in the state stood in a gravel lot in the gray light and pretended real hard not to be listening. The sheriff never came back to Rosie's for lunch. Boyd Tanner sat in a state interview room for 6 hours that same night, and somewhere around the 4th hour, faced with the boat and the bank records and a developer's frantic phone calls all time-stamped on his own phone, he did exactly what Cole said he'd do. He sold Gordon Cale for the best price he could get, which was a reduced sentence in exchange for every name, every date, every dollar. And I'll say this for Boyd Tanner, the only good thing there is to say about him. When they finally sat him down and it all came apart, he didn't lie. He could have. He could have dug in and dragged it out and made those 2 women testify and relive it a dozen times over in a dozen hearings. Instead, the weak man made the one strong choice left to him, which was to tell the truth, all of it plainly, and take what was coming. It didn't make him a hero. Nothing could. But it spared Rosie and Maggie a year of courtrooms, and I believe, near the end there, that old Boyd was trying in his small and shabby way to become just a little bit of the man he'd once put on that badge to be. He never got to wear it again. But he told the truth. Sometimes that's the most a weak man can manage, and it's not nothing. The whole crooked machine came apart in a month. The condemnation orders got thrown out. The judge resigned. The county inspector who'd found phantom problems in the Hendersons' wiring and 100 other places lost his license and then his freedom. Kale Development Partners collapsed under a state investigation, its assets frozen, its owner facing charges in 3 counties. The interchange got built eventually, years later, by a different company, and it went in 2 miles south, and it never touched the town at all. And here's a small mercy that came out of all that unraveling. When Kale's assets got picked apart in court, some of what he'd taken got given back, and Bill Henderson's boy, the one who'd left for a warehouse 300 miles off, came home with enough of a settlement to open a little hardware and feed store on that same north corner. It isn't the same as what was lost. Nothing gives you back a father who stopped smiling. But there's a Henderson on that corner again, and in a town like Cedar Hollow, that means something. As for Danny Reyes, Rosie hired him back the very next week. Put him in an apron and stood him behind the grill and never once, not to this day, brought up the jacket or the dark car or the months he stood by that door. His mother got her treatment, because it turned out the club took care of that quietly, the way they do things, no fuss and no thanks wanted. Danny's still there. Runs the kitchen now. And when the old-timers tell the story of that afternoon, Danny's the one who gets quiet and goes to wiping down a counter that's already clean, because he's the only one in Cedar Hollow who knows in his bones how close a decent person can drift to the wrong side of a room, and how much it costs to walk back across it, and how much it's worth once you do. Rosie kept her diner. Of course she did. It's still there, out on the county road, chrome and glass, the same booths, the same pie. She hung a photograph by the register, a picture somebody snapped that afternoon of the whole lot full of motorcycles, and when new folks ask about it she just smiles and says, "Oh, those are some friends of ours. They came by for pie one time." And she never charges a man in colors for coffee, not to this day, not one of them, though Lord knows they've all tried to pay. Maggie kept working there, but something was different after that day, and everybody saw it. She stood up straighter. She looked people in the eye. That habit of going small, of folding herself down to fit under whatever storm was passing, it finally fully left her, and it never came back. Because she'd learned the thing it took her a whole hard life to learn. That being quiet is not the same as being weak. That she had been strong the entire time, strong enough to carry it all alone for 19 days to protect a man she loved. And that she was married to somebody who would ride through the night on nothing but a feeling to stand between her and the whole world, and step aside for no one. She started telling her own story after a while, too, in bits and pieces, to younger women who came through town with that same watchful flinch she used to have. She'd pour their coffee and sit down across from them on her break and just talk, quiet, woman to woman, and more than one of them left Cedar Hollow braver than they came. She'd spent her whole first life making herself invisible. She spent the rest of it making sure the next scared woman got seen. That's what she did with what happened to her. She turned it into a lamp and left it on for the ones still out in the dark. As for Cole, he never touched Gordon Kale. Not once. I want you to sit with that. He never had to. He'd learned the hardest lesson a dangerous man can learn, which is that the loudest thing in the world is a man who has finally gone quiet, and the deepest justice doesn't come from your fists. It comes from making sure the truth ends up in the right hands, and then simply standing there, patient and unhurried, while a cruel man's whole world comes down around his ears by the weight of the things he did himself. They tell it different ways around Cedar Hollow now. Some folks say Cole Vance ran a crooked developer clean out of the county without lifting a finger. Some say the Hells Angels saved the town. But if you ask Cole, on the porch of the little house he shares with Maggie, he won't tell you any of that. He'll just tell you about a motel room 3 states away at 2 in the morning, and a feeling he couldn't explain, and the wildflowers he bought on the way home. He still has them, matter of fact. Or what's left of them. He picked them up out of the gravel that afternoon after Cale drove off, brushed the dirt off the brown paper, and carried them inside to his wife, bent stems and all. And she laughed and cried and swatted his arm and called him a soft old fool, exactly like he knew she would. She pressed a few of the blooms flat inside a book. They're still there, brown and paper-thin now, tucked between the pages on a shelf in a house on the county road, in a town that a bully in a gray suit was absolutely certain he could steal, right up until the moment a quiet man came home a week